So many days since you went away. How much?
Since moving to Mississippi and focusing more on storytelling and doing that, in my case, through photography, I work a lot with reporters, and I get to hear or be there when the interviews are taking place. And on occasion, I also do interviewing and writing for my own assignments. I find that the people here are so open and so friendly. Growing up in maybe a little bit more quieter and closed society of New England, it's way more open here. I feel a sense of community and connection when I talk to people here because of how warm people are. This idea of Southern hospitality is something I didn't experience growing up, and really I think is a big factor in why my wife and I have stayed. You're able to talk to people, and maybe someone that you just met at the grocery store is telling you their life story on this first meeting. So I think that that's different compared to where I grew up. And in some ways, in many ways, it's helpful for me as someone who's trying to document people's stories, because there is a willingness to share, there's a friendliness, a warmness, and if anything, people tell you much more than you expect to hear when you first start talking to them, and I like that. One of the first things that that my wife and I dealt with when we moved here was people in the community asking questions about us. They were very curious about us and wanted to know our story. And maybe related to your previous question about how it is talking to people and understanding people here, there were many occasions where people asked a lot of background information about us and colleagues of ours at our different jobs, and they wanted to know where we would go to church and where was our family, how were we spending our holidays, and things that I wasn't used to really sharing with people outside of my own family circle. And so that was something that we got used to, kind of this small town community feel. For good and for bad, people really want to know what's going on in your life. And we had many people that we interacted with, studied with, or worked with that really delved into your personal life. There was a sense of curiosity. So around 2018, and then more so in 2019 and in 2020, the lower Mississippi Delta region started to get a lot of flooding. The Mississippi River was high. There was multiple factors, a lot of rainfall, more water that was coming down from the north as it worked its way downstream. And you were starting to see this repetitive story of flooding, destroying the farmland. Most of the area is very rural, and agriculture is everything. And this was, of course, the lifeblood of the local economy, the population, the livelihood of so many people were, it was all impacted, it was all connected. And so I would be assigned to go down there and cover the event in your traditional news sense, cover the flooding, get pictures of farmland that was covered in water for months and months upon end. And I started to notice that because of how rural it was, there were very few places for people to eat. You may have to drive 45 minutes north or south just to get to a place where there's multiple restaurants. But there was one restaurant, Chuck's Dairy Bar, that remained open throughout all of this. Chuck's has been around for a long, long time, for decades, and only passed ownership once to the current owner. And they've kept the lower Delta fed for all these years, even during floods and pandemics. And in this year, we had a historic drought. What I wanted to do on a personal level through that story with the Bitter Southerner was talk about the history of Chuck's, the ownership of Chuck's, and the community and its connection to Chuck's, because throughout all of these challenges, roadblock after roadblock, Chuck's stayed open. And a big reason for that is the owner Tracy Harden, her family, and her staff have kept it going for so long. And what I started to realize, beyond the traditional news coverage I was doing, this was a creative but also powerful way to explain what was happening in the area, but also the significance of this one place, a dairy bar, which is not a fancy restaurant, but it has classic American hamburgers, chili burgers, a meat and 3 sides, like things that people felt comfortable eating, but also the place itself became a way for the community to stay connected, support each other, and get through all of these challenges. And I approached that story on my own at the beginning, and then started to receive some grant funding to make it possible to get back down there repetitively. And for me, it was one of the most rewarding experiences I've had as a Mississippi storyteller, because I got to know the people so closely who are affiliated with Chuck's, but also the community, and understand this small town sense of what it means to be connected during challenging times. And I think there's a lot of value for storytellers to take on work at a personal level and see where it goes. Not everything will take off and develop into longer projects, but I think there's a lot to be gained from personal projects where you're invested as a storyteller, not because you're working for someone else, but you're working as an individual that's trying to tell the stories of others in a fair way and in a long-form way that does their stories justice. I remember driving past Chuck's many times on different assignments and not stopping because I was always in a rush, but it's a super photogenic place to begin with. It's a classic American diner look, particularly the furniture inside, but also you notice that there's trucks, farmers and their farmhands, and cars are always outside of Chuck's. It's the main place to eat. Again, if you miss Chuck's, you can't find a good meal for a long way. And I didn't stop for a few years, and I started to hear about Chuck's as I was going down there more frequently, and I'll never forget the first cheeseburger that I had. It's in Mississippi, they like to say greasy, but it was just a delicious cheeseburger, fries, and a shake, and it's the kind of like the classic idea of an American diner, but here in the super rural farmland, and people depend on it, and their menu's quite expansive. But I'll never forget my first bite of having, Chuck's burger. But I think also, as soon as you enter the building, if you're a storyteller, you know that there are many stories to tell, whether you're doing it right there in Chuck's like I did physically, which, by the way, there's a little motel behind Chuck's, and it's called Chuck's Motel. And when I was working on this project, I was determined to stay there. So I used some of the grant funding to literally stay on the premises for days. I think it was 4 or 5 days without leaving. But yeah, you can see just how many stories pass through their doors, whether it is the people working there or the people who come in, and like I said, they depend on it for survival.
I had a thought while you were talking.
So many nights since you've been.
Living in a small place, rural location like the Delta, it can be a little bit challenging to network with publications beyond local publications. And when I first started my photography career, I started super local, and that's kind of advice that I give to younger photographers and reporters, or people who aspire to work for larger publications. My advice usually is start local. My first job was actually for the local newspaper. Sadly, here in Cleveland, the paper closed during the pandemic, and it was in existence for 100 years. And I explained to younger storytellers that there's great value in starting local, getting more practice, enhancing your skills, and the networking comes along through experience and through time. It's not fast, and I think for even in my memory, I wanted to be the one that somebody would call when a national story received attention here. And that didn't happen for many years for me. you kind of have to put in the groundwork. I worked for the local paper. I worked here at the university, writing their press releases and their photography. And then eventually started to get more freelance assignments. And those ranged from editorial assignments to commercial work. And it was probably 5 years, maybe a little bit less, before I started to get frequent calls from places like the New York Times or the Washington Post. Yesterday I was working for The Guardian, which is out of London. And, there was some frustration at the beginning for me. Why are reporters or photographers coming from other places to do stories when I live here? I think it goes back to what I just said, that you do have to enhance your skills, find your style. Stylistically, editors want to know what they're going to receive from you if they're depending on you to do a story. And all of those things take time. It requires some patience. And I think that if you work hard, if you communicate well, that's another big thing that I tell people. All forms of communication that you're having with editors or potential clients need to be professional. And doing that for a number of years, you'll start to get more opportunities to network and meet with people who may work at these larger publications or may be based in New York or London or you name it, but it's not a very fast process. And for some younger people that can be hard. But I think, again, if you work hard, remain professional, communicate well, you'll start to have those opportunities. And I was very lucky. I applied to what's called a portfolio review, and it was in New York. It was organized by the New York Times. And I was able to go there with a portfolio of work and actually show editors who ended up hiring me, what I was capable of, what my style was. Here's a little bit of my experience. And that's an opportunity that I encourage young people to take advantage of once you have a body of work to show. It's another great way of networking. And then I would say the last thing is social networks have been also they kind of exploded during the time that I started freelancing. And it's a great way to communicate as well. Sometimes I can send a pitch to an editor through Instagram and get a response. A lot of times that doesn't work, but there's things that you can do now remotely instead of having to go to New York if you can't afford to get up there. Just keep making that body of work, that experience, growing as a professional, and when you can do that, you'll receive the jobs, you'll get hired, and you can be a contact person depending on where you're based. Even if it's here in a small area, being in the Delta, I get a lot of work where they need coverage from Memphis down to Vicksburg, and sometimes, of course, I go out of state for work as well. Being that professional that they can depend on will bring the networking. The networking kind of presents itself to you, and I think it comes with time and experience. It's pretty amazing to see how drone photography and drone video have exploded in recent years, and I was a little hesitant at first, because there's actually a lot of serious elements to flying a drone. You have to, if you're going to do it for work, be certified by the FAA. So you have to get an actual pilot's license, which is something I did. And I think that it's an amazing technology that allows you, in my case as a photographer, if I need to show the landscape of the Mississippi Delta, which is incredibly flat, but from an aerial perspective, it's completely different, and you see the lines and the shapes and the textures that go beyond the flat horizon. And before, I would have to actually have somewhere in the budget to hire a pilot to fly, to get up in the sky and do that. But now you can get to so many places from an aerial perspective that you couldn't do so easily in the past. And that's a remarkable thing. But the other thing that I tell young people who start to get involved with drones, or anyone who's getting involved with drones, that you should take it very seriously. There are many places that you can't fly that are restricted areas, or flying it in conditions that are unsafe, like very windy or super cold. On a professional level, it's changed the way that I can show a story. I always tell people as well, like, you want to be able to set the scene really well with close-ups, mid-range for photos, but also wide scene setters, and drones have been amazing at doing that. I got my registration, and and now get assigned sometimes to just do drone work. So it's a beautiful tool that can be used to show stories from above, if you will. I think one thing that I always keep in the back of my mind when I'm working as a storyteller is gratitude. You know, I feel grateful that the person or the people in front of me are willing to let me pick up the camera and point the lens towards them. And when I work on a daily basis, I think about if I was on the other side of the camera, and I try and follow what the golden rule, if you will, you know, to treat others as you would like to be treated. And if somebody was telling my story, I would want them to do justice to the story, but also to paint me in a light that is true. And that's something that I strive for every day. You know, there are great benefits to that, because not only are you elevating that person's life and that person's story, but you as a photographer are able to gain the trust and a connection with the people you're working with. And doing this as a career, that's changed my life, because previously I'd been quite quiet and sheltered and grew up in such a rural location. Cameras have been a way for me to connect with people. And again, as a storyteller, I take pride, but I also feel a sense of gratitude in the connection, the willingness, the ability for people to trust me and to allow me to point the camera at them. And I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful for the opportunity to do it as a professional, but also for that human connection. I would encourage people to think about that as you tell other people's stories.